Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It's Saturday at 10:40. Another winter day. That's well, kind of seasonal, but not really. Kind of gray, gray and overcast day today, but on a little bit on the warmer side. No snow at all. We haven't had a snowstorm in weeks, probably at least a month. So very crazy, very strange. Uh, Winter this year. I've never seen. I was talking about it with a couple of friends the other night or yesterday. Just like I couldn't think of a winter that I've ever experienced like this ever before, especially here in Maine. But it is what it is. So hope everyone's doing good. I appreciate there's been a lot of people commenting on some of the videos. I kind of got about a week ago, or I should say last week, I got a little bit backlogged with the amount of videos I was doing and as far as like new content. And I uploaded a whole bunch kind of in one single day. And then I didn't do a video yesterday, but I uploaded about 3 or 4 videos at once and did some posts around those movies. So it's cool. It's great. I love that people are commenting more and more. The cool one of the coolest things is somebody who is open to seeing some of these films, or maybe they've seen them, but then there's like a little bit of a back and forth as far as, well, if you like this movie, check this movie out. And to me, that's the best part. That's continues to be the biggest attraction for me and the most fun around doing this crazy channel. Is just it's not really about me or even really the channel per se. Yeah, it's like, yeah, I want to get at the end of the day, I want to eventually have this channel grow as much as I can. I want to keep developing it, keep trying to learn new things around social media, particularly in the YouTube universe. But it's really, the main thing is about the movies. If I get somebody who comes across a movie that is something I might have seen, and or that piques their interest, something they've never even heard about, but then there's a like a correspondence, back and forth around that movie, and I love that, especially when it's a movie that's not, maybe so well known and things of that nature. So it's always super cool. So I went to Bull Moose on Wednesday last week, and I really, really had a great haul. I bought a bunch of new movies, and I really lucked out. It was one of the best ventures to Bull Moose. There were a few movies that I got that I really, really wanted to see and to own, and I got them, and then I got some other movies along the way. So this movie today is a movie that I had heard about a lot recently. I kept hearing about it for some reason, and then I remember seeing this movie as a kid, um, and it was, I don't know, kind of a traumatic experience when I was a kid. And that is the one and only. This is it's a notorious movie in the world of horror grindhouse movies, and also it's a zombie movie too, and that is Doctor Butcher, M.D. I got this on Wednesday, and I finished up the special features part of this movie. There are so many. There's probably about 3 hours of special features on here. This was put out by Severin, and again, this I've said it many times, but this is the reason, or that's the reason why I will be kind of the determining factor if I'll buy a movie, whether it's something I had seen when I was a kid or something I'd never seen before. This movie, I have a kind of a crazy story around when I was a kid. I I remember seeing this movie when I was probably, oh, geez, I don't even know if I was in high school, which is kind of nuts to think that I saw this movie at such a young age. Um, Dr. Butcher, M.D., and it's also under a different name, Zombie Holocaust. It came out in 1980, and it was it was directed by Marino Girolami, who was an Italian director. There's an interview with his son on here when he talks in depth about a lot of his films and his really interesting life. But I remember this came out in 1980, and I remember when I was a kid, I had a sleepover where I stayed. I had stayed over my uncle's house, and I grew up in Rockland County, New York, which is kind of in the suburbs of, or yeah, kind of the suburbs away from New York City. New York City was about maybe about 45 minutes away from my house. So we grew up where I grew up on the outskirts. And it's a real I haven't been back to that area in a very long time, but it was a very even then it was a very congested kind of built up area. We did have some wilderness and some woods and things like that, and Bear Mountain was very close, which is a beautiful place. It actually is the location where the Last of the Mohegans was shot, and that was a little bit further north up in the mountains. But that was it's an amazing film, but really there are parts of where I grew up that are very much you know picturesque, if you will. And it was very congested, but we did have these big mountains by us, and then Bear Mountain was about 35 minutes further north or south, further from where I grew up, and it was a big park and beautiful spot. But that was where they shot the Last of the Mohegans, and that is where the story came from. So there was a cool balance between nature and the city. I used to go to the city a lot as a kid, and my grandmother, where I grew up, my grandmother lived right across the street from me, like directly across the street. So I would go over there, obviously, as a kid a lot. All my family lived in New York. On my mom's side, grew up, in an Italian household. My mom's maiden name is Masiello. So I always was used to, growing up and having, these big dinners or big holiday gatherings, lots of pasta and all those kinds of things. And on my dad's side, his family was mostly in Long Island, and Long Island was about an hour from us. So we would go down there. We would go to Long Island a lot to as a family, and my uncles and my aunts and stuff lived there. So we would go there, and that was on my dad's side. But on my mom's side, everybody was my uncles and my grandmother, my grandfather. We all lived really in close proximity to each other. And the town that I actually grew up in was called Garnerville. And there were surrounding towns like Stony Point, Haverstraw, Nanuet, New City, what have you. And there were all these little towns that were connected. And they were all, pretty built up, like I said, pretty congested at the time. I haven't been back there in many, many years. And I don't know, I don't really have one of these days I'll go back, but it's, I can only imagine what it's like now. But my uncle lived about 10 minutes or so away from me, and occasionally, like, he was really into sports and hockey games. And there was a time when I was into hockey quite a bit. I never played it, but I was into going to hockey games, and he always had season tickets to Ranger games. So I would go to lots of games with him to Madison Square Garden as a kid. And that was always fun. It was all kind of a crash course, in people who drink lots of alcohol and who are like really obnoxious and curse and yell and scream and get all fired up and angry. And but he lived really close to me, and he was into films. He liked horror films. Both, obviously, I've talked a lot about my mom. My mom was kind of the main person that got me into horror films and to movies. She still, and well, she was a guest on my show. She was a guest on here last year. And my uncle was also very much into movies. And when they were younger, and my mom is a little bit older, when my mom was younger and they were kids, my mom would take my uncle and some of his friends to the movies. They would go to the drive-ins, and they would see a lot of these matinees, some of these grindhouse movies. And I've talked to her a lot about that. And they used to, she has a lot of cool stories about them going to see, two or three Bruce Lee movies back to back, or a few horror movies. And I was like, oh. And that was obviously, before my time. All that, by the time I came into the picture, I was, all of that whole kind of culture went away. And I grew up, you know, during the time of VHS and what have you. But that would have been cool to have experienced it. But occasionally, like once in a while, I would stay over. I'd go over to my uncle's and I would stay over. And he liked horror movies. And I remember back, and again, this was the back in the time of VHS, and he used to rent horror movies every now and then. And one of the movies that he rented, I remember, was Doctor Butcher, M.D. And I believe that this was probably the very first um, gore fest movie I've ever seen. This is like the first movie where I ever saw, you know, just where it was so incredibly gory. And I remember staying. I was going to stay over his house, and we watched this movie together, which is crazy. And it scared the shit out of me. It scared me to where I was like kind of hysterical, and I couldn't sleep there. And I think I even made him call my mom to take me home, because it like kind of traumatized me. And I think at that time, and I can't even remember. I was really young. I don't even think I was in high school. Like I said, I think I was, I don't know, maybe 13. It was before I was a freshman in high school. And I'm pretty sure that I had seen horror movies before. I think by that time, the first couple of horror movies that I remember seeing as a kid, that kind of left an impression on me was like for instance, like the first Friday the 13th movie, and which came out in 80. And then I remember seeing Halloween for the first time, the original. I remember those two movies specifically were probably, obviously I had seen a bunch of movies at that time, mostly on cable and VHS. But I remember those two movies in particular stand out as far as like the first kind of slasher movies I ever saw, the first, kind of horror movies. And like Halloween was always on, was like in syndication at the time. It was on cable, so I remember seeing it a lot as a kid, and I rented it. And also the same thing with Friday the 13th. I rented the shit out of that as a kid on VHS. So I think that those were the first two movies. But Doctor Butcher M.D. was a different experience because it was pure kind of grindhouse sleaze, but it was just that the movie had so much gore and was kind of fucked up and really kind of disturbing, and it just had a like a stranger thing about it. And I remember I remember I'd never seen a movie that had really over the top violence and gore, and I believe that this was the movie. So I literally have not seen this since then. It's crazy. So it's been, I don't know, 1,000 years. And this movie had come up in a couple of videos I was watching, a couple of channels, and I got last year I bought one of the greatest slasher horror movies ever made, Pieces, which I've done. I think I've done one or at least two shows on. And there's a documentary on there where they talk about a lot of the movies that were being played in the 70s and 80s on 42nd Street in New York. And Dr. Butcher MD was a movie that was talked about, and it came up. And so it was, it kind of jarred my memory. And it's great. It's a great movie. It's totally bonkers crazy. It's kind of centered on this kind of crazy mad doctor, hence the name Mad, Dr. Butcher. But basically, he's like a part of this, like, I don't know, a cult religious group that, where he basically is into the occult and is a practitioner of the occult. And he has this, like, nefarious plan to kind of create his own like kind of race of zombies or monsters, and he does these experiments, and it definitely has like an influence, from Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or at least the Doctor Frankenstein character, where he's this mad doctor genius, and he's like cutting up these different body parts. He goes around to hospitals and various other places and cuts up these bodies and decides to kind of make these weird, mutant monster creations out of them, and they come back as these zombies. And he tries to like raise this army, and that's kind of the premise of this movie. So it's like totally crazy. Um, this transfer of this movie is so amazing. This is like, again, there's like 3 hours of special features on here. It's really good. There's two different versions. A big thing that happened back in the 70s and 80s with exploitation movies, a lot of movies were cut, where where the distributor, the distributing company of a lot of these films would, kind of, after the movie was done, or they would buy the rights to the movie, they would, re-edit or repackage the movies in order to bring it to certain markets. And so you had, lots of different versions. A lot of movies would be, especially with, say, foreign movies, and in this case, an Italian movie, a lot of movies were kind of rebranded, or they would go under a different title, or they would be cut. Sometimes the gore would be cut out, or there would be a director's cut. And this movie has both versions, and it's under two different titles: Dr. Butcher, MD, and then the other title is Zombie Holocaust. And very interesting. I watched Dr. Butcher, MD, first, and then I watched a little bit of the other version, which is basically, for what I saw, is exactly the same movie. I don't know. I didn't see really any difference. The only thing that was different was the title. It was still very gory. There was nothing. I didn't notice any crazy edits or anything like that. But it's cool to have, from a historical context, having two different versions of the same movie. And again, the bonus, the coolest thing about this movie and this beautiful package, this was put out by Severin. Most of the movies I bought this past week were all from Severin. Severin is one of the biggest, arguably the biggest boutique label out there that puts out, that reissues all of these, amazing slasher grindhouse movies. And I think pretty much every movie I bought last week was a Severin movie. So really awesome. I have a ton of them, of their titles now. Severin is great. My favorite company is Mondo Macabre, and I haven't bought any new Mondo Macabre. I have not really seen any on the market, which is a little bit sad, and kind of depressing. When I was going to Bull Moose in Waterville, that was the main. Those were the main. I was buying a ton of their films. They had so many in stock. They, for some reason, I haven't really come across them anymore. I don't, and again, I don't order movies online, but lately it's all my last couple of trips and purchases have all been pretty much Severin releases, and Severin is probably, overall probably the biggest or the most prolific or most popular company in the whole kind of boutique label world. But the thing is that's really awesome about them is they really go the extra mile. Like they pack each movie with, an amazing array of special features and interviews that is, just so fascinating. And this is definitely one of the best. There's all kinds of great special features about the director Maurizio Girolami, and there's a really great interview with his son. And at one time before he got into filmmaking, he was a championship boxer in Italy, and there's actually a statue commemorating his time as a boxer. He was like a world class boxer. He was also the most respected boxer or athlete in Italy at the time, which I thought was pretty wild. Um, and he was responsible for so many movies at the time, and I probably have seen his. You probably seen some of his movies, uh, and Loverboy was one movie that he did in 1975. And again, all of these films are going back, you know, quite a few years. Again, it always goes back to my favorite decade, the 70s. Loverboy, which came out in 75, Violent Rome in 75, A Special Cop in Action in 76, Desirable Teacher 2, hilarious. These titles are just hilarious. That came out in 82. At Last in 75. Where, Where Can You Go Without Me? 79. College Girl on Vacation in 1980. These all look like, none of these titles are ringing a bell. I don't think I've seen any of these movies. But he was very prolific. And they are definitely like, you know, at least from what I'm seeing, they're definitely like these real sleazy exploitation movies. Gigolo and the Bully, 1982. Um, yeah, just hilarious. The Fury of Achilles, 62. So going way back. But again, that's one of the coolest things. It's like this could be my introduction to his work because I watched this movie when I was a kid, and now I own it, and now rediscover the film, buy it. Now I own it, and through the special features, I find out the information about the director, or the filmmakers, and or the actors, and then I want to dive into it a little bit further. So then it opens up a whole nother, avenue, another opens up a whole nother door to discovery. Where I can this it leads me to discover a whole shit ton of other movies kind of in this genre, or by this very filmmaker. Again, that's just it's awesome. It opens up this great rabbit hole. So that's been the coolest thing. So I highly recommend this movie. Like, this movie is uh, ultra gory. It's such a bizarre movie. It almost has a point of where it the storyline, there is at one point where it jumps, where it's taking place. Initially, it's taking place where there are these it's taking place initially, it takes place in this hospital, and there's somebody in this hospital, in this morgue, that is taking these body parts. That's kind of where the movie starts, and then it eventually goes into this kind of investigation as to what's going on, and people are starting to die and get killed in all kinds of gruesome ways. And then it leads to where you're all of a sudden, in the jungle on this island. And it kind of felt like when the shift happened, especially with the location, that you're like, wait, what's going on here? It feels like suddenly two different movies. But then a few things happen, and then you realize, no, wait, it is actually kind of a cool continuation of the story, and then it makes sense. But at first, it was like the editing is kind of off and so disorienting that you feel like, oh wait, what happened to the first movie I was watching? Suddenly we're in this jungle and there's like zombies, but then you're like, okay, a series of events happen, and it makes total sense. But this movie is kick ass. Like, it's super gory. It's got some of the best practical effects. It's super sleazy. Um, it's just great. Like, it's the very definition of like pure grindhouse cinema. It's just great, and there's a really cool documentary on here about 42nd Street, mostly about things in the past that happened there, but kind of where it is now. And there's a documentary where they interview these guys that were kind of involved with the grindhouse scene back then, where they were producers working, in the world of distribution. They ran movie theaters. They ran these publications, magazines, where a lot of these grindhouse movies would be reviewed. And it's funny because it's like, it was shot, I think, a couple of years ago, and they're in 42nd Street, and they're just talking about, you know, they'll show old photos of what these particular areas looked like, or this area looked like, say in the late 70s or the early 80s, right, when 42nd Street was like just such a sleazy, dirty place, but yet amazing. And then they'll, show what it's like now, and it's, Disney owns all of it, and it's all cleaned up, it's super gentrified, and it's like all family friendly. And to think that there was like, you know, wall to wall porn theaters and peep shows and like just all kinds of sleazy um, movies being shown all the time, and prostitutes and drug deals going down, people getting stabbed, and just crazy. One of the coolest movies I think that really kind of incorporates that period in New York, that really you really get an emphasis as to what New York was like then, kind of how dark and seedy it was, is of course Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. You really get, that movie. Was filmed during that period, so you get that essence all the time. You're in that universe, and to think when you see this footage, of where of what 42nd Street is like now, it's like it's wild. It's wild, but amazing movie. Can't recommend it enough. It's totally gross and ridiculous and incredibly strange. But yeah, Dr. Butcher MD, 1980. It's one of the best Italian movies, probably that came out during that period. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.